Noom. The HR coordinator didn't look up when she scanned my badge. That was normal. What wasn't normal was the way her fingers stopped moving on the keyboard. She looked at her screen, then at me, then back at the screen. Could you just wait here one moment, she said, her voice dropping to something careful and quiet, the way people speak when they're trying not to cause a scene. I wasn't worried. I was 31 years old, applying for a full-time nursing position at Meridian General Hospital after 3 years as a traveling nurse. I had my license. I had my references. I had every document my guardian uncle had helped me put together when I turned 18, and he handed me a manila envelope and told me not to lose it. I had never had a reason to open it and question a single thing inside. The coordinator came back with a man I hadn't seen before. He was wearing a lanyard that said compliance, and he was not smiling. "Ms. Claire Hadley," he said, "that's me. We're going to need you to come with us." "It's a formality," he added quickly, though nothing about his posture suggested a formality. They took me to a room that had no windows and 2 chairs. They asked me to sit. I sat. Then they left, and I was alone with the hum of the fluorescent lights and the growing feeling that something was very wrong. 40 minutes later, a woman walked in wearing a navy blazer and an expression that was completely unreadable. She set a folder on the table between us. She didn't open it. "My name is Agent Patricia Solis," she said. "I'm with the FBI." I think I laughed. "I'm not proud of it." I said, "I'm sorry, there must be a mistake." She looked at me for a long moment and said, "The social security number you've been using since childhood belongs to a girl named Claire Ann Hadley who died of a cardiac defect in 1983. She was 4 months old." The fluorescent lights kept humming. "You," Agent Solis said, "have been flagged in the National Crime Information Center since 1997. You were reported missing at 18 months old." She finally opened the folder. She turned it toward me. There was a photograph. A family, mother, father, a little girl with dark curly hair sitting between them on what looked like a porch somewhere warm. The mother was laughing at something off camera. The father had his hand on the little girl's shoulder. The little girl had my nose. My exact nose. The small upturn at the end that my uncle had always called a button nose, and that I had always quietly hated. "Your biological name," Agent Solis said quietly, "is Evelyn Rose Carver." I need to back up, because none of this makes sense without knowing what my life looked like before that moment. My uncle, a man I had called Uncle Gerald my entire life, had been my guardian since I was 3 years old. He told me my mother, his sister, had died in a car accident. He told me my father had never been in the picture. He told me I was lucky to have him, and he told me this often enough in enough different ways, that by the time I was 8 years old, I had stopped thinking of it as information, and started thinking of it as just the shape of my life. We moved frequently. Every 2 or 3 years, a new city, a new school, new faces, I would just begin to recognize before they were replaced by different new faces. Gerald worked in property management, he said, which explained the moves. I accepted this. What I could not accept, no matter how many years passed, was the way he looked at me sometimes. Not with cruelty exactly. More like inconvenience. Like I was a line item in a budget that kept coming up higher than he wanted. When I was 12, I broke my arm falling from a bike and cried in the emergency room waiting area, and Gerald sat 2 seats away from me reading a magazine. Not because he was in shock. Not because he didn't know what to say. He simply could not be bothered to close the distance. When I was 16, I came home with a report card that was nearly perfect, 1 B, the rest A's, and he looked at it and said, "You'll need to do better than that if you want any kind of future, because I won't be supporting you forever." He wasn't warm. He wasn't cruel. He was simply absent in the way that leaves the most damage, because you can never point to the wound directly. There was no single terrible thing. There was just the ongoing, low-grade message that I was a problem he was managing rather than a child he was raising. I left at 18. I worked my way through a nursing program at a community college, then a 4-year degree, then the traveling contracts that let me save money and stay mobile because staying mobile was the only life I'd ever known. I was 31 years old, and I had never once thought to question the documents in that manila envelope. "Who reported me missing?" I asked Agent Solis. "Your parents," she said. "Thomas and Diane Carver. They reported you missing in March of 1997. You were 18 months old. They have never stopped looking." Something shifted in my chest that I didn't have a name for. Where are they? Savannah, Georgia, she said. They still live in the same house you were taken from? I looked at the photograph again. The porch. The warm light. The mother laughing. How? I said. How did this happen? Agent Solis's expression didn't change, but she took a breath before she spoke. We believe Gerald Marsh, she said. And hearing my uncle's last name said out loud by an FBI agent was its own particular kind of vertigo. Abducted you from your family's home in March of 1997. What we did not understand, until very recently, is why. She slid another page across the table. It was a financial document. Dense. Full of account numbers and routing numbers and legal language I had to squint at. The Carver family, Agent Solis said, established a trust in your name at birth, standard practice for families of their means. The trust was structured to pay out a living stipend to whoever held legal guardianship of Evelyn Rose Carver until her 25th birthday, at which point the full amount was to transfer to her directly. I was very still. Gerald Marsh, she said, was your mother's cousin. He knew about the trust. He had access to your family's home. And for 29 years, he collected that stipend. I thought about the moves. Every 2 or 3 years, always to a new city. Always somewhere my family would not think to look. I thought about the way he had handed me that manila envelope at 18 and told me not to lose it. A dead girl's identity, clean enough to hold up to a nursing license application, but apparently not to an FBI background check. And I realized that I had not been raised. I had been stored. He hated me, I said. And I heard my own voice come out strange and flat, because I was the reason he could be caught. Agent Solis said nothing, which was answer enough. I was in that room for 4 hours. They were methodical and thorough and genuinely kind, which somehow made it harder to hold myself together than if they had been cold. Agent Solis brought me coffee. A victim's advocate named Marcus sat with me through the second half and handed me a box of tissues without making it a moment. They told me Gerald had been under quiet investigation for 8 months. The flag on my social security number had triggered an automatic review, and the review had connected dots that had been waiting 30 years to be connected. They told me I was not in any trouble. They told me I was, in fact, the point of the entire investigation. They asked if I wanted to call anyone. I said no. There was no one to call. That had always been true, and I had never noticed how true it was until that moment in that windowless room with the humming fluorescent lights, and I understood for the first time that the isolation had not been accidental. Gerald had kept me from building roots the same way he'd kept me from staying in one place. Loose connections meant no one who would ask the right questions. What happens now? I asked. We have agents at Gerald Marsh's current residence, Agent Solis said. He'll be in custody within the hour. And my parents? She paused in a way that told me she had been waiting for this question. They've been notified. They know we have a lead. They don't know it's you yet. She looked at me carefully. That conversation is yours to have. On your timeline. No one will pressure you. I looked down at the photograph again. The little girl with my nose. The mother laughing at something off camera, and even in a still image, you could feel that she was the kind of person who laughed easily, who laughed fully, who would have taught her daughter that the world was basically safe. I had spent 31 years not knowing the world could feel that way. I want to call them, I said. I won't describe that phone call in detail because there are no words I found that are adequate to it. I will say that my mother said my name, my real name, Evelyn, in a voice that sounded like someone exhaling after holding their breath for nearly 3 decades. I will say that my father couldn't speak for the first 30 seconds, and I understood exactly what that felt like. I will say that the 3 of us cried in a way that was completely undignified, and I was grateful for every second of it. They drove from Savannah to Atlanta overnight. They were at the FBI field office at 7 in the morning. I recognized my mother's laugh before the door opened. Gerald was arrested that same evening. He did not go quietly, according to Agent Solis, who told me afterward with a professionalism that didn't fully hide her satisfaction. He had apparently insisted, loudly and at length, that there had been a misunderstanding, that he had raised me, that he had sacrificed for me, that I owed him something for the life he'd given me. I've thought about that a great deal since. The audacity of a man who stole a child and a family's money for 29 years and still managed to frame himself as the aggrieved party. His attorney, I learned later, tried to argue that the statute of limitations on kidnapping had expired. She tried this exactly once. The federal prosecutor's response was immediate and, from what I understand, fairly withering. There is no statute of limitations on federal kidnapping when the victim is a minor. Full stop. But even setting that aside, Gerald's attorneys had apparently failed to account for something called fraudulent concealment, the legal principle that when a defendant actively conceals their crime, the clock on any applicable statute of limitations doesn't start running until the victim discovers what was done to them. I was 31 years old. I had discovered what was done to me approximately 48 hours ago. As one of the federal prosecutors put it during the pretrial proceedings, in a line I will remember for the rest of my life, the concealment was the crime, counselor. You cannot hide for 30 years and then invoke the clock you stopped. Gerald also, it turned out, had not been paying taxes correctly on the trust stipend income for the better part of a decade. The financial forensics team described this as unusually helpful in terms of building the full case. He was charged with federal kidnapping, identity fraud, financial exploitation, and tax evasion. All of his co-signatories on the trust accounts, two of them, a former colleague and a distant relative who had been receiving small cuts of the stipend in exchange for paperwork, were charged as accessories. He pled guilty on all counts 18 months later. There is a question I have been asked more than any other since this happened, and it is some version of, did you ever suspect? The honest answer is no. And also yes. And also, I'm not sure those are the right categories. I suspected that something was wrong with Gerald, the way you suspect a foundation crack in a house you've lived in so long you've learned not to look at the wall directly. I knew the warmth was missing. I knew the care was performed rather than felt. I knew that I had grown up with a specific and particular loneliness that did not seem to match what I watched other families do. But I didn't suspect a crime. I suspected I was simply a person who had been dealt a cold hand and would have to warm it herself. It took meeting my actual parents to understand the difference between cold cards and a rigged game. My parents and I am still getting used to saying that, still feel a small catch in my throat each time. Are people I would have chosen as friends if I had met them as strangers. This is not something I expected. I had built, without realizing it, a quiet fear that meeting them would be awkward and strange and full of the weight of all the lost time, that we would sit across from each other and feel the gap that 30 years had carved and not know how to cross it. Instead, my mother made me coffee on the second morning and asked me how I took it, and when I said a little too much cream and not enough sugar, she laughed and said, "That's exactly how your grandmother took it. She always said sugar was for people who didn't trust the coffee." I had a grandmother. I had aunts and uncles. Real ones. I had cousins who sent me voice memos introducing themselves, one after another, like a very chaotic welcome parade. My father and I are the quiet ones in the family, it turns out. We figured this out on the third day when we ended up on the back porch together while everyone else was inside talking, and he said, "You need a minute," not as a question, and I said, "Yeah." And we sat in silence for 20 minutes, and it was the most comfortable I had ever felt with another person. 31 years. That's what Gerald stole. Not just my identity, not just my name, not just the trust fund he'd been draining since before I could walk. He stole 31 years of that porch, and that silence and that specific comfort of being with people who are built the same way you are. The financial piece took longer to resolve than the criminal case. The trust, at Gerald's point of arrest, still had a significant portion of its principal intact. He had been spending the stipend income but hadn't been able to touch the principal, which was structured to pass directly to me on my 25th birthday, and had been sitting in a protected account for 6 years waiting for an Evelyn Rose Carver, who never showed up to claim it. My family's attorney, a woman named Patricia Okafor, who I suspect is quietly terrifying in a courtroom and warm about it, invoked something called the constructive trust doctrine to recover the portions Gerald had spent. The argument, roughly, is that when someone comes into possession of assets through fraud or wrongdoing, the law treats them as holding those assets in trust for the rightful owner, even if the money has already been spent. You cannot consume stolen assets and then claim they no longer exist. The court agreed. Gerald also owned 3 properties. He had purchased them with stipend income. Under the same doctrine, those properties were treated as held in constructive trust for me. His attorney objected. The judge was not particularly moved by the objection. I am not someone who thinks money fixes things. I want to be clear about that. The money did not give me back 31 years. It did not give me back my grandmother, who passed away in 2019 and whom I never met. It did not undo the particular specific loneliness of being 18 years old, with a manila envelope and nowhere to belong. But it was mine. It had always been mine. And watching the court confirm that, watching the law look at what Gerald had done and call it by its right name, mattered to me in a way I had not expected. Not because of the money itself, but because of what the ruling meant, that the truth of what happened to me had been formally, legally, permanently recognized. That the story of my life had been corrected in the record. I am writing this, or I suppose, telling this from my parents' house in Savannah. It is warm here in a way that Atlanta never quite managed, a different quality of warm, slower and heavier and smelling like something green. My mother's garden is through the window and she has just come inside and is telling my father something that is making him smile in the particular sideways way that I have learned in the past 14 months, means she has said something slightly ridiculous, and he finds her completely wonderful. And, always will, I have a room here. Not a guest room. My room, which my mother decorated with a carefulness that made me have to excuse myself the first time I saw it. She had asked me, over the phone, about colors I liked in books I was reading and whether I preferred a desk or a reading chair, and I had answered without fully understanding what she was building. I still work as a nurse. I'm no longer traveling. I took a position at a hospital 12 minutes from this house, and I drive the same route every day, which is a thing I have never done in my life before, and which I find I cannot take for granted even now. Gerald is serving his sentence. His co-signatories took plea deals and are on probation. His attorney, to her credit, stopped pursuing appeals after the second failed attempt, which I took as the legal equivalent of reading the room. Agent Solis sends me a text on the anniversary. Just a check-in. I have come to look forward to it. People ask me sometimes if I'm angry, and the answer is yes. Of course, there is an anger in me that I don't think will ever fully dissolve, that sits in the back of my chest like a coal that went cold but kept its shape. 31 years. A dead baby's name. A man who looked at a child and saw a revenue stream and a liability. Yes, I'm angry, but anger is not the thing I lead with anymore. Because I have also sat on that back porch with my father in companionable silence. I have listened to my mother's grandmother's theory about coffee and sugar. I have received 14 months of chaotic voice memo introductions from cousins. I am still learning to tell apart. I have, against all reasonable expectation, been found. And I have learned something that Gerald Marsh counted on me never learning. That the people who tell you that you are a burden, that you are a mistake, that you are an expense, they are generously absorbing. Those people are not telling you the truth about yourself. They are telling you the truth about themselves, about what they need you to believe so that you will not look too closely, so that you will not ask the questions that lead to the right room and the right folder and the right woman in a navy blazer who turns it all over and says, "Here is what actually happened to you." I am Evelyn Rose Carver. I was stolen. I was found. And I am, for the first time in my life, genuinely, not as a performance, not as something I tell myself before sleep. Okay,